Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending the second of three open houses as it pertains to the Mule Deer Winter Range update. This is the second meeting that on Monday we spent the evening at Sisters High School. My name is Peter Gutowski. I'm the Community Development Director. County staff that's here. We have Tanya, who's a senior planner, Will, our planning manager, Tariq, our associate planner, and Rob, who's helping with production. Is that a little bit better? Yes. Okay. So just introducing staff, we have Andrew Walsh with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. So I'm just going to provide an overview of this evening. Unlike in Sisters, we had, where everyone was in person, we have attendees who are participating virtually. So we're going to have it's approximately 45-minute overview of the science behind the winter range, as well as the amendments that we're making to the Deschutes County Comprehensive Plan and Zoning Code, and then we'll open it up to questions. I will use this mic to a show of hands to allow any and all of you to ask questions as it relates to this program. I think what we'll do, just in fairness, is we'll rotate in person, and then we'll go to those that are virtual, and we'll alternate back and forth. Tonight's meeting, like the one we had on Monday, is to prepare all of you for your participation at the first public hearing, which is scheduled on April 13th, which is a week from today, in this room at 5:30. And that's when we have and I should pause, we have a planning commissioner in attendance, Commissioner Altman. Commissioner Altman and 6 of her colleagues will sit at this dais, and we'll take formal testimony on these amendments. So we want to use this evening to give you the context for why this inventory was prepared, how it was prepared, and how Deschutes County has proposed amendments as it pertains to the Comprehensive Plan and Zoning Code. So this isn't the meeting to testify in favor or against. You certainly are welcome to offer your opinions or your follow-up questions, but we're not going to take any verbal comments tonight as part of the formal record. So stay involved and start participating next week when we have the formal hearing. I mentioned that this is the 2 of 3 open houses. On Monday, we're going to be at Redmond City Hall at 5:30. And so for all of you who are interested in this topic, or if you have neighbors or friends who would benefit from this presentation, please encourage them to participate. The presentations today are in line with what was presented on Monday and what will be presented on Monday of this week and what will be presented next Monday. So the content is the same, so you don't feel like you need to attend all open houses. I see some familiar faces from Sisters. However, if you want to stay involved and hear the conversations or the questions that are being introduced, of course, we welcome a participation from our residents and stakeholders in this community. So I'm going to transition to Tanya and to Andrew, and let them have an opportunity to provide context for the wildlife inventory. And like I said, it's going to be about 40 to 45 minutes. So bear with that, but I think it's going to be really helpful for you to understand, again, what is being proposed, why it was being proposed, and the context behind it. Many of you are familiar with this building, but there are restrooms down the hallway, drinking fountains, so please feel free to use the facilities because we want to make sure that all of you, if you have questions or comments, that we receive those. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tanya, and then we'll get this process started. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, good. I was also going to repeat the line about the bathrooms. They're still over there. These are the things that I like to know when I go into a room. But so thank you all for coming. Okay, good. The presentation is up there. Adapting to different rooms for different presentations can be a bit of a challenge. So I'm just curious here, how many, by show of hands, have received the notice from us in the mail, from the county? Okay, so more than half. How many of you were there at Sisters on Tuesday night? Okay. Tarek, thanks for raising your hand, our staff member. And then lastly, I'm just curious, how many have I spoken to you on the phone? Okay. I just like to know the audience. It's helpful. So thanks for all of that. That helps us kind of shape how we speak about this. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about the project. Oh, and my last little thing. With the sign-in sheets on the outside of this room, if you'd like to be included on our email list, please write your email very clearly, and then we will add you to that list. We were going through some of the ones in Sisters, and it's just a little bit difficult to discern some people's emails. So please make an effort. I know that sounds silly to say, but thank you. I appreciate it. So I'm going to go a little bit into the background of this project, and then I'm going to talk about the structure of kind of the whole process. Then I'm going to turn it over to Andrew, and then I'm going to come back and speak about the regulations themselves, and then we'll go into the Q&A. So why are we here? As Peter pretty much covered this already, but this is to provide an overview of the project, to explain what is on the table. I think there's been a lot of confusion about what these amendments are actually proposing and what they're not proposing. So we want to make that really, really clear, what's on the table. And as we'll stress throughout this process, it's very much in draft form right now. Everything's kind of on the table. What's out there is not necessarily a done deal by any stretch. This is why we're having these meetings. So I want to make that very, very clear. As Peter noted again, if you would like to provide formal input, testimony, opinions, that is for the public hearing on the 13th. You may also email me, and I'll have that contact information at the end. We've received a bunch of comments so far that's super helpful. They're available on our website. All right, a little bit of background. So the first phase of this project took place in 2020 and 2021. It was funded by a Department of Land Conservation and Development Technical Assistance Grant. At that time, we realized that the existing wildlife inventories that we use in the county, and there's many besides the deer, as you're probably aware, they're basically 30 years old, which is, as much as I like to think 30 years ago was not that long ago, it kind of was. And so we realized that they don't reflect the current conditions. They don't reflect what's on the ground. They don't, or in the air in certain cases. They don't reflect the newer data collection methods. There's, as Andrew will say, there's many new ways of collecting data about where these species go, where they stay, where they travel to, where they die, all of that stuff, as well as modeling. So it just wasn't up to date. So this phase one of the project, we used an interagency working group, which consisted of ODF&W, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, as well as an independent wildlife biologist, who I believe is participating via Zoom tonight. They got together and looked at their data. They compiled their more up-to-date data, vetted their methodology with each other, and developed the 3 new wildlife inventory areas. And so these address the mule deer, the elk, and sensitive birds. These were the first 3 that were kind of put out there to see what might an update to these look like. So as part of that project, we had a bunch of surveys. We had some open houses. Maybe, did any of you participate in the phase 1 process of this? Okay, a couple people, thanks. Took the general temperature of the public. It was not meant to be a scientific survey, but we just wanted to see what people thought about a potential inventory update. The general indication was support of an update in the most general of senses. So the Board of County Commissioners directed staff to proceed with one of those 3. So it's a really big project, as you might imagine. So it was more prudent and more realistic to bite off one of these, try it as a pilot project, and then see what happens. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So we started that in late 2021. We had to pause due to kind of staff capacity and some other time-sensitive projects that the Planning Division had to address. But we restarted in January 2023, and here we are in April. So counties aren't required to do these updates. I've had a lot of people ask, why are we doing this? Which is completely a fair question. We're not required to, but based on that the information that we gathered during phase one, that these things are very out of date, it's not reflecting what's on the ground right now, and that there was a general interest in pursuing it, this is why we're doing it, or proposing this. We don't know where it will land in the end, but so even though counties are not required to do this, there are rules, Oregon administrative rules, that very, very specifically explain how to do it. And this is OAR Chapter 660, Division 23. If you're interested in diving into that, we discuss it a lot in our findings document. It talks about kind of how you determine an inventory, how you assess what a conflicting use is, and I'll get to that in a minute, and then how you determine how you're going to have regulations that address these protections. So what the project does in a nutshell, it creates a new zone, a combining zone, which is essentially an overlay zone. So this is popped on top of your existing zoning and has additional regulations. It's called, in a very succinct title, 2023 Mule Deer Winter Range Combining Zone. We call it the WAMD for short. And that's Deschutes County Code Draft Chapter 18.91. There is an existing wildlife area combining zone. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. It addresses more than just deer. That's called the WA combining zone. This proposal does not address that. That is a separate, discrete area with its own regulations. So these are two separate things. In many cases, they abut each other, as you might see on the maps, but they are separate. Everything, and I will keep plugging our website this whole evening, is available on our website, deschutes.org/muledeer. So this is where you'll find the maps. You can drill down into the maps, the draft amendments, the findings, all of that stuff, as well as the record, the official record for the hearing. This is a very small, and I apologize, these screens are extremely small, view of the map of the proposed zone. It's similar to this. This has a little bit more detail. The blue on the map is the new proposed zone, and the orange is the existing wildlife area combining zone. The gray are the UGBs that are not part of this. If you do go to the website, you can kind of drill down, you can zoom in a ton, you can put in an address. Most of the time that works. Every once in a while it'll send you to Alabama or something, but most of the time it works. And so you can really explore where that is and where that isn't. Excuse me. And just a quick overview of the zone itself. This new zone, the WAMD, it's about 188,000 acres. However, about 82,000 acres of that is non-federal. As we know, Deschutes County has a ton of federal land. So that's about 43% of this new proposed zone, 82,000 acres. So therefore, that 82,000 acres is what is subject to the county zoning. This does not address federal land. We can't address federal land through Deschutes County. We don't have jurisdiction over that. And that's a whole nother conversation that I'm sure will come up. But just to be clear what this does address. And on the slide here, I do have a breakdown. Again, it's hard to read, of the zones that this combining zone overlays over. So the majority is on EFU, exclusive farm use land. And then the next two biggest are rural residential areas, RR10 and MUA10. So that's just a brief overview of kind of where this combining zone sits. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to talk about about mapping the inventory and the science behind all of this.
All right, thanks, Tanya. I know some folks in the room, certainly not everybody. My name is Andrew Walsh. I'm the district wildlife biologist for ODFW, based here in the Bend office. I've been in the Bend office since 2017. I was in Prineville for a couple of years before that, and a lifelong Oregonian who's been with the agency for about 13 years. So yeah, it's my pleasure to talk to folks tonight. I view it as people who are showing up to these types of meetings are doing it because they care about the land, and they care about the wildlife, and they care about the use of the land, and that's all good stuff to me. So yeah, glad to see a good crowd here. To start things off, see if I can figure out how to. There we go. So to kind of set the table for our ODFW's role in this process, I wanted to kind of just zoom out, for the statewide agency mission statement. First of all, ODFW's mission that we try to use to guide all of our actions is to protect and enhance Oregon's fish and wildlife and their habitats for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. So that said, zooming into our role in land use, for the most part, ODFW is a non-regulatory agency. There's a few exceptions for specific land uses, but for land uses like we're discussing here, we're not a regulatory agency at all. We primarily provide information and science-based recommendations to our partners at counties and the community development departments, to try to stick up for wildlife and their habitats when we can. As Tanya described, she did a good job kind of outlining the statewide Goal 5, the process that includes wildlife and their habitats, among other kind of natural resources. So that's the framework we're working under here. We do, I listed on the screen there, we do have a statewide OAR, Oregon Administrative Rule, in statute for a mitigation policy. It's generally for larger scale projects than just a private lot development. But big game winter range under that statute is considered what's called a Category 2 habitat, being essential and limited. The mitigation goal is no net loss of habitat quality or quantity, and to provide a net benefit. So that's the framework under which ODFW views biological winter range for big game animals. So moving on to, some folks in here know this certainly better than others, but I'm gonna kind of try to get us all on the same plane here. This is how ODFW, how we kind of manage the wildlife of Oregon. Oregon is split into, numerous wildlife management units is what we call it, and the map on the left there shows the different wildlife management units. You can see Bend in the middle. Primarily, we're going to be talking in the Deschutes County realm about the Metolius unit, the Upper Deschutes unit, and the Pliny unit. Highway 97 is kind of the dividing line east and west between the Upper Deschutes and Pliny unit. The Metolius unit is north of Highway 20, basically. So the next chart over there, I wanted to frame, I've got a lot of questions during this process about data specific to areas of these proposals, or even data specific to Deschutes County itself. So I threw this up there to just show, unfortunately for this process, that is not the scale at which ODFW collects our data. Obviously, it would be much handier in a county process if that were the case, but for, so the outline on the right here, the red kind of largest outline there, that's the district we manage out of Bend here. The Metolius units on the north there, up into Jefferson County. You can see the blue outline of Deschutes County. And the black outlines within the middle are the different wildlife management units at which we're collecting the majority of our data, especially when it comes to mule deer. So there's just not a clean boundary for Deschutes only. The units are spilling over into Klamath, Lake, Jefferson, Crook, and so it's not a clean process for that, but for the numbers and data we do collect within the scales we collected at, it's pretty good data. So we try our best to apply it during processes like these, the best we can. And the spatial data I'll show you is really helpful for that, because it puts it on a map where that data was collected. So staying with data collection, I will kind of get moderately in the weeds, I think, and happy to, during the question session, get further in the weeds if that's what folks are interested in hearing about. as Tanya kind of alluded to, since the early 90s when the current zone was put into place, the data and methods for data collection we had back then to inform that process were archaic compared to what we have now. Just like technology and all other facets of the world, since 1992, technology for wildlife management and data collection on the landscape is pretty incredible now. This picture on the left here is a mule deer we're putting a GPS radio collar on. That's where a lot of the data I'm gonna show you comes from. Is those GPS collars around their neck, and we can program them to collect two locations a day, 5 locations a day, whatever fits to answer the question we're asking. On the back of that collar is a GPS unit that's sending signals up to GPS satellites in space. We can log onto the internet and access that data from the website without ever having to put our hands on that collar again. Download the data of where that deer has been every time that GPS unit collected data. So that's obviously super helpful and much better data than the old days of the typical, with a radio antenna going out and trying to triangulate where a deer is on the landscape, or get in a plane and fly around in circles and try to mark your best guess of where that deer is standing. Now we're getting, down to the 5-meter increments of where that deer is spending its time year round, multiple times a day. So the data from that is really helpful. It helps us identify winter ranges. It helps us identify summer range, the home ranges, the migration routes that those animals are using in between. Most deer in Central Oregon are migratory, and twice a year they're taking a route between their winter range and their summer range, and then back again. Where are we? Early April. In about 3 weeks, 4 weeks, those deer are going to start heading down upslope from their winter range. I might be a little later this year with the snow, but they follow that green up into the higher country, and then kind of the reverse track in October, November. They head down to where they are now on their winter range to avoid that deep snowpack. So those collared animals really help us identify those corridors that we can use for habitat projects or highway crossings or all kinds of actions to hopefully help secure those routes that they're traveling. We'll see a lot more of that in the later slides here. Another aspect of the collaring, you get the survival rates of the deer on the landscape. You can get your annual survival rate for the mule deer out there, and that's really helps inform, especially as we start using models to model our population trends and those sorts of things. And if you're lucky with those collars, you can identify what is killing the animal, the cause of mortality. Once that collar lays still for 12 hours or so, it flips a switch and it sends up a mortality signal to the satellite, and we'll get an email in our email instantly with the coordinates where that collar is laying still. So as long as it's not summertime, or as long as the coyotes haven't been kicking it around too much, we're able to get out there quickly and ascertain whether it was killed by a cougar or hit by a car, or if we're lucky and it's cool like this time of year, maybe take some samples and see if it died of a disease, or do a necropsy basically, which obviously is also really helpful information. So all that to say, it's cool stuff. Most people like hearing about it, but also it's much more fine-tuned and valuable data than the last time around, back in the 90s. Kind of the other side of the slide there is our kind of more of our survey methodology and how we collect that type of data that I'll also show. In the fall, basically between Thanksgiving and Christmas, we are counting those deer on their winter range, and that's when we're getting our buck to doe ratios. It's after hunting season at that point, so we're getting our bucks per 100 does basically, and also our fawn ratios. At that point, fawns are 6 or 7 months old, and so we're seeing how many fawns per does there are at that point in the year. Wintertime surveys, late February, early March, is usually when we're trying to get a population estimate. That's usually when deer are most concentrated on their winter range and easier to count from a helicopter. It would be impossible to do that, in the summertime when deer are up in the forest. But once they're out, especially mule deer, once they're out in the desert generally, or the more open country on their winter range, and really concentrated, that's when we can set up these stratified random sample surveys and get a pretty intensive, statistically valid count of the mule deer population for an area. We're doing that in general every third year on each wildlife management unit across Eastern Oregon. And then once we kind of come out of spring, we survey them again, and that's basically getting an overwinter fawn survival. So you're getting fawns per 100 does on the land, fawns per 100 adults on the landscape. At that point, the bucks have shed their antlers, so it's tougher to tell bucks from does. But yeah, you're able to compare that from your fall numbers to your spring numbers and get a rough idea of how hard that winter was on your fawns. That's the typical kind of throughout Eastern Oregon strategy for data collection on mule deer currently within the agency. That said, here's kind of some of the trends. People have probably seen similar slides to this in different presentations perhaps, but that's kind of the orange or red line on top there is the management objective. We have management objectives that are set from a public process. Every so often they get updated, but basically it's directs ODFW to manage for certain buck ratios and certain numbers of deer in each wildlife management unit in Oregon. So the orange line, this is for Deschutes District. So this is for my district combined, kind of that first slide I showed you, not just Deschutes County. But that orange line is the combined total for those 4 units of what we're aiming for. And that blue line is where we're at and been trending since 1998. You can see a few peaks and valleys, but if you were to draw a trend line through that, it's certainly heading one direction. So that's where we're at with that. This kind of splits the same data out and zooms in a little bit since 2013 to current. But this is splitting it out by wildlife management unit. So the gray, the kind of the highest one up's the Pliny unit. The yellow is the Metolius, and then the Wagon Tire and Upper Deschutes along the bottom. So it's kind of lining those out. Everything's trending in the same direction, some more than others. But yeah, that's. And I'll also say this isn't unique to Central Oregon, and it's not unique to Eastern Oregon. We're struggling, with mule deer populations throughout Eastern Oregon, but also throughout much of the range of mule deer throughout the western U.S. This is not a unique to Central Oregon problem, but it is a disturbing trend. So one of the questions that we always get when we're talking about this stuff is well, you guys are still allowing hunting of mule deer, and isn't that just driving the population down more? So we like to include some context to that end, and that's what this slide's attempting to do. So in 1991, mule deer hunting went to a controlled draw instead of just a general go to the store and buy your tag. So you have to put in for a lottery system and use preference points, and so we're able to control the number of hunters on the landscape, the number of tags per unit. In kind of the bar graph on the bottom left is showing the difference in tag numbers for 1991 compared to more recently. So you can see the drastic cuts in tag numbers, by leaps and bounds. We're issuing way fewer tags in response to these trends of mule deer. The graph on the right, the line graph there, is kind of just the same idea. That's just in the Paulina units. That'd be east of Highway 97, kind of, down through Lapine and further south there. But, for going from 16,000 hunters back in 1980 down to, what are we at now? Like 800, I think, tags in the Pliny unit. So just we're not hunting them like we used to. We're certainly dialed back that opportunity. And the thing that allows us to still hunt them is the buck ratios, like in the upper right there. So I mentioned we have management objectives for the ratios of bucks to does we'd like to manage for. Those are in the buck MO column there in the black font. For the upper Deschutes and the Pliny unit, it's 15 bucks per 100 does. For the Metolius unit, it's 25 bucks per 100 does. You know, through the public process, we've decided with landowners and with hunter interests that that's a unit we want to try to manage as more of a high quality hunt. So there's generally, we're managing for higher buck ratios in there. It also makes it harder to get that tag to hunt it. The numbers there on the right, the current are the, you know, as of last fall 2022, ratios for those units. So we're, you know, well above buck ratios in all of our units. The problem is the population trend. There's just not as many deer out there now. So even if you have, you know, good ratios of bucks, there's not as many bucks on the landscape as there used to be. And that's why, you know, we cut tags, but that's plenty of bucks on the landscape to get the breeding and reproduction done. That's kind of the idea behind it. As you'll see later, it's adult doe mortality that's driving the trend, not buck mortality. Same idea, just kind of showing the management objectives in the red font there for population numbers, not ratios, and the most current estimates and where we're at the percent of those management objectives as of you know, currently. So, you know, 56, 25, 70% of where we want to be respectively going down those three units. So for those, I think there's a few folks who were at Sisters the other night, and it was pointed out, and I owned it, that I neglected to include this information in there. So it is in there now, and it will be available, you know, once this all gets posted online. So this data is from the South Central Mule Deer Study, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But it's the cause of mortality of those collared mule deer, primarily does, back from 2015 to 2013, or 2005 to 2013. Sorry, and it ranged from kind of this area up here in this part of Oregon all the way down through Klamath Falls and Lakeview. So kind of that whole swath of South Central Oregon. So you can see, you know, we were able to discern just about half of the mortality. There's always a lot of unknown mortality in these projects, but of the 53% of mortalities, we're able to discern a cause. That's the breakdown. I guess it's fairly self-explanatory. Predation was the highest percent. Vehicle strikes were quite large as well. Legal harvest was 20%, and illegal harvest is 22%. I think both of those numbers would probably be lower now with the reduced tags and some actions we've taken and kind of reduced amount of poaching on the landscape. I think other natural would include diseases and those sorts of things. Other human would probably include things like caught in fences, you know, those sorts of not fitting other things, but human infrastructure caused. So this data, I kind of wanted to point out, you know, this South Central study, I'll talk about it more, was a huge deal, and it's so much valuable data that we've used it for several actions. One of those actions drove the increase in the anti-poaching efforts. You know, I see some OHA folks in here and other hunters, and you know, when this information came out that illegal harvest was a higher percentage than legal harvest, that really raised some attention, and I think there's been good steps taken in the direction of kind of focusing on that more. So that's why I think that number now, you know, 10 years later, would probably be a little less. This data has also been used. This is the data that informed those highway crossings on Highway 97, Lava Butte, Sun River, and now as we work down through, as they're widening Highway 97 going south, this data was huge in that. And when, you know, we have the corridors, I'll show in a minute, identified from these collared deer, but also when you can show that 18% of the deer dying out there were struck by vehicles. A lot of these deer, like I was talking about, their annual migration back and forth, it's a lot of them are crossing Highway 97 or crossing Highway 20 at least twice a year, right? When they do that migration, that'd be difficult for me, you or I, to go look after looking both ways right now. Let alone a deer who's not not nearly as savvy about oncoming traffic. That's a gauntlet. So yeah, before we kind of dive into more of the data, I wanted to just talk for a second about what we're talking about here and mule deer habitat. What is winter range? It's generally the lower elevation areas that are providing, those shrubs for forage, relatively less snow. Obviously we're all living down here, not up at Subtle Lake or Three Creeks Lake right now. There's the deer kind of see it the same way. It's where you migrate when there's a ton of snow at the high country. They're also looking for thermal refuge, whether it's a juniper tree or a big sagebrush or the lean-to of your barn or whatever it is. On those clear, cold nights, something between you and the vacuum of space goes a long ways to holding some of your heat a little closer to your body. So they're also looking for some structure and security. When a mule deer moves to winter range, their body condition is declining. It's declining, and it's declining throughout the entire winter. They're just the vegetation, it's not green and leafy and nutritious. They're browsing on bitter brush and whatever else. They're not putting on weight. Their body condition's gradually declining. Right about now, late March, early April, they're at the very end of their reserves, depending on how the winter was and how their winter range is. This is a vulnerable time for them. So basically, with a good winter range, there's pictures of the Metolius winter range up around Billy Chinook, some of that PGE land up there that's pretty good winter range for the mule deer. With a good winter range, you're hoping to just kind of slow that decline down a little bit, so it's not as sharp of a body condition decline, because that sets them up for getting fatter and happier that next spring and summer, being able to nurse those fawns they may be carrying and about to birth. So it all has a kind of cumulative effect. Unfortunately for everybody, this prime ground that's often the winter range is limited on the landscape naturally. It's closer to rivers and those lower elevation areas, where everybody wants to live, us and wildlife and everything. So it's a limited scope on the landscape instead of the giant, vast wildernesses of the high Cascades. So yeah, it's kind of naturally where a lot of human development occurs, and that makes it susceptible to disturbance and fragmentation. And we try to, you guys are familiar with some of the road closure areas in the Tumalo and the Metolius, and trying to keep it as quiet as we can out there for wildlife and protect the resource in that way. So that kind of leads to, there's a lot on that slide, but I think it's important to talk about some of the stressors, because unfortunately, wildlife biology and mule deer decline, there's not a silver bullet for anything. There's not a one cause of anything. Everything's just so interconnected. So these are some stressors on mule deer in Central Oregon, and what we, ODFW and our partners can do. Drought is certainly a concern. This wet winter and spring is gonna help some things along that line, but it's still, we're in a historic drought, and that affects the fitness of wildlife. There's no doubt about it. Vegetation is drying up and unpalatable 3-4 weeks earlier in the summer than it was before, right? And that impacts the amount of fat and weight that those deer are putting on their summer range. We can implement habitat projects when we can. We work with landowners a ton to try to help that, and water sources and those sorts of things. Another stressor, and it just becomes worse and worse as more more folks move to Central Oregon and visit Central Oregon, right? The highway loads on the traffic loads on the highway. Yeah, it's not good news for deer or us when we're trying to make a left-hand turn out onto the highway. We're working on some highway crossings, kind of throughout Highway 97 and elsewhere in Oregon as well. There's a lot of attention to corridors and crossings right now throughout the West, and in Oregon and the legislature and our partners at ODOT. So we're working on that. We put flashing billboard signs up down south when the migration is on. Some of you have probably seen on Highway 97, just to, in those dusk hours, get people to maybe pay a little bit more attention. It's tough. Disease is another stressor, something we can't do a whole lot about. We keep our eye on it. We monitor outbreaks. If there's really bad adenovirus or hemorrhagic disease outbreaks, we can cut hunting tags in an emergency way that year. But otherwise, there's not a whole lot you can do about it. We're trying like heck to keep chronic wasting disease out of Oregon. It's right on our border in Idaho. It's been coming this way, and for those that don't know, it's a horrible disease that affects deer and elk and is almost impossible to eliminate from the landscape, and it's 100% fatal if once a deer is infected. So we do a ton of testing for that, and there's a lot of focus on that, and we have a plan in place for if and when it's ever detected. Predation is certainly has impacts on mule deer populations. There's since the ballot initiative in the 90s that outlawed the use of hound hunting on cougars, the cougar population has increased drastically in Oregon, and there's no question that leads to more predation of ungulates. Deer are the favorite prey of a cougar. They're the perfect size prey, and that increases predation. We have wolves kind of dispersing around and recolonizing all of Eastern Oregon, including Central Oregon. The east slope of the Cascades, they're carnivores and predators out there too. So that doesn't help, but it's a part of the equation. I like to point that out to folks. It's only a part. So what can we do? There's our hands as the agency are somewhat tied when it comes to addressing. We're talking about stressors and what can we do when it comes to addressing predation. We offer a cougar tag that's our most affordable tag, and it's good 365 days a year. They're just really difficult for hunters to target. They're just the nature of the animal. So that sort of hunting opportunity is not nearly as impactful on the cougar population as when they were hunted with hounds, and that's just a fact. Disturbance is another stressor, especially year round. Really, we were able to focus on the winter range. Like those winter range road closers I was talking about. We have 3 of them here in Central Oregon, from December 1 through March. That really do a good job, and I think most folks that I talk to anyway are pretty supportive of. They get the idea of leaving some quiet space in between open roads out there where deer shouldn't be seeing motorized vehicles. People can ski and hike and do whatever else you want in there, but it's the motorized vehicle that's being closed out. And it does provide some pockets of refuge for wildlife in the winter. Disturbance in summer range habitat is certainly an issue too that we try. Everybody knows about the recreation boom in Central Oregon and how crowded the Cascades are in the summertime, and that's where a lot of deer are going to spend their summer too. So we work with the managers, the Forest Service generally, and on that, and try our best to leave pockets of refuge where we can, and just try to stick up for wildlife wherever we can. The one last stressor on my list up here is the habitat alteration and fragmentation, which maybe applies more to this proposal we're all here talking about. And we we lean on the Goal 5 protections that are in place in each individual county in Oregon to try to help, preserve whatever, kind of open spaces and habitat remains within those bounds. My note up here in the middle is kind of talking about these factors all have an impact, whether direct or more indirect. When a deer gets eaten by a cougar or a deer gets run over by a truck, those are pretty direct and obvious impacts. When a deer is constantly being bumped around because of this or that on their range, or they show up to their winter range habitat and it's been severely altered and fenced off, those aren't so obvious. That deer's not going to drop dead there on the spot, but it's impacting its fitness, and it's going to leave it more susceptible going forward to things like disease and predation and road strikes and all some of the other more obvious direct impacts. So it's all a big tangled web. The depressing note at the bottom there is currently in the last 8 years, that since we've started this latest study with collared mule deer, the Metolius and Upper Deschutes wildlife management units, so right here where we're standing, have a 70% annual survival rate for adult does. Adult doe mule deer have a 70% survival rate from 1 year to the next, and that's biologically that's just not enough to maintain a population. That's the worst in Eastern Oregon, in the state. And the kind of the gold standard you shoot for is 80%, give or take, annual survival and a healthy recruitment rate to kind of sustain a population. If you have a 70% annual survival rate and fairly low recruitment, like we're all seeing now in mule deer, as mule deer managers, recruitment of fawns, you're not replacing those adult does that are dying, and that's going to drive your population down. It's just a mathematical fact. Tanya kind of showed this the existing protections, Goal 5 protections in Deschutes County. The red is the mule deer that does exist. We do have other zones on the books. Down around Lapine, there's a mule deer migration zone. Out on the desert in the eastern Deschutes County, there's antelope overlay that has some standards for development out there, as well as some sage grouse protections. But anyway, this is kind of just an overview of that, and we can chat about the South Central mule deer study, because that's going to be the remainder of the slides, is the data kind of coming from some of that work. So the mortality data I showed you earlier came from this as well, but 452 mule deer were fitted with GPS collars throughout kind of that swath. So the dark blob towards the north of that map is Bend. You can see Redmond right above it. And then down south, you're going all the way through Klamath. You can see Highway 97 running north and south there. So you're dipping down into California a little bit, because that's where some of those deer ended up. So that's a lot of landscape for this study to be spread out across. But we did have good representation in a lot of Central Oregon, so that's how we're able to apply that data here. We had representations in the Metolius and North Paulina winter ranges. So I've already mentioned it was used to inform the Highway 97 crossings. And it also led to the development of two resource selection function models, without getting too far in the weeds, because it's not my specialty either. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to grab my water. The GPS collars on the on the animal are excuse me. All right, the GPS collars on the animal are sending up that location of exactly where they're using, and we're able to take that information and overlay it over maps of the habitat and what exactly is existing on the landscape. So you're seeing, this deer was spending time in areas with 40% shrub cover and 20% slope and north facing, all these different layers you can apply on the GIS system underneath in the habitat to kind of describe the area. And then they run an analysis of the percentage of time spent by these collared deer and what that habitat looked like. And then they're able to kind of create a model that shows the predicted use based on that habitat across the landscape. So they made two models, one for the winter range and one for summer range. I think the winter the winter range one is the one that Tanya has posted on the website by Priscilla Coe. But especially the summer range one is really useful when we're working with the Forest Service to try to comment on their proposals for work, on the forest and trying to leave some habitat intact for mule deer. This is kind of just a pretty slide of Deschutes County and what some of those collared deer look like. So each different color is a different deer, and you can see, just how much a lot of them move. Up between kind of Redmond and Sisters, that Buckhorn Road area. A lot of those are crossing all the way down and going, towards the high lakes for the summer. Down further in southern Deschutes County, out more on the desert, towards Fort Rock. A lot of those are going east-west, crossing Highway 97, but just super long migrations. And they're doing this twice a year and almost stepping in their same hoof tracks, back and forth. It's pretty incredible to really zoom in on those datas. You'll have one in October 18th or whatever, and one April 29th, and the dot will almost be on top of the other dot. They're just like they're on a string. So it's an incredible life strategy that they do. But this is kind of just shows some of the data we have behind some of these recommendations. Tanya's already showed this, and there's a bigger picture of it on the wall there, but those are the polygons that the group came up with to recommend. Most of you may have seen this. This is kind of just a screen grab from the story map that was part of the first part of the process. But this, the colorful part is that habitat the predicted use model that I was talking about. So the kind of redder and purpler the color, the higher value habitat that is, based on all those hundreds of mule deer we had collared and the land they were actually using, and the conditions that exist on the ground in those areas. So you can kind of see the gradient there, and the dots, the kind of cream colored dots there are observations, of us from the helicopter or the pickup during the winter time. And generally they follow those areas that are higher predicted use. That's where we're seeing those deer on our winter counts. What else is on this one? Oh, the reason the model doesn't go, the reason the nice pretty model colors don't go all the way up through, between Bend and Redmond is there just wasn't, we didn't collar deer kind of in that Tumalo winter range area during this South Central project. So they weren't able to build the model through there. We've since collared deer in that area. That's what kind of the bronze home range circles are. And we have the observation data there. But yeah, that's the reason for the gap there. It doesn't mean anything more than just the model wasn't able to be run for that area. So this slide, I pulled from our database over the last 5 years of what we have seen, again, either from the helicopter in February or the pickup in December. The larger the dot, the bigger the group of deer that dot represents. So, some of the larger dots can be, 20 to 40 to 60 deer groups. The other much smaller dots are just, smaller groups of deer. But that kind of paints a little bit of the picture of where we're seeing deer. You can see I put the proposed areas over, underneath there. I will say, some of it can be a little misleading sometimes because the lack of a dot. I've talked to some folks, and there's no, you don't have any dots on my parcel or nearby me, and some of that is access. We don't fly 100 feet above ground level in a helicopter above everybody's place and count deer. We can't drive around and access every side road either, when we're doing the counts. That said, this is what we have. This is from all collared mule deer. So in addition to the South Central study I've been talking about, we also, since 2016, have been doing, kind of Eastern Oregon wide effort of collaring mule deer and kind of reconfiguring how we manage deer based on the migration they do in and out of wildlife management units between when we count them and when we hunt them. And it's kind of confusing, other than, deer don't stay in these nice, pretty divided lines I showed you at the beginning, right? They don't care about crossing that ridge top into the next unit. So anyway, in the back end of ODFW's process, we're working on some things to manage better, including the range of a deer, not just its home range, and kind of by herd levels. So a lot of these data are from that. The circles with the little stars and dots in the middle, those are called winter centroids. So what that is for each one of those is an individual deer. And you take a deer's winter range, that's scattered around a map in a cluster, and right in the statistical center of that, you drop that centroid, and that's what a winter centroid is. The bronze line leading away from that centroid is leading to their summer centroid. Same concept. The center of their summer range is where that line is terminating. So that's kind of showing some of the dispersal and how messy it can get, with some of them going north-south, some of them going east-west, some of them not going far, some of them going tremendous distances. That's what you're showing here, and some of the connectivity considerations that we think about.
Andrew, is this available online?
This Tanya will have the presentation online, and I don't know if we said it at the start or not, but we're here for questions after this. I've seen a couple hands kind of pop up, and I've ignored them because I'm on a roll. But there will be plenty of time for questions and flipping back through the slides and all that.
I just posted the presentation, I think this afternoon, so it's on the project website.
So yeah, and that kind of leads me to something I'd like to point out. And I've heard from a lot of folks, maybe some in this room, they want to see the data, and we've been planning on this part the whole time and had kind of the preliminary what we had in the data in the story map. But like Tanya said before, this is a proposal that the public process is just starting on for comment, and that's why we're here kind of explaining it. I'd much rather be able to explain it to you in person and answer your questions than you try to figure out what the heck all this means, looking at it on the story map. This, I think, is my last slide. So this is based on that South Central data. And it's called a Brownian Bridge movement model. And what this is doing is, all this movement and migration I've been talking about, this takes it and identifies corridors on the landscape that are more valuable than others based on how many deer are following those same paths. So you can see the code 1 through 4. The yellow and red are the highest valued corridors, based on those hundreds of deer that had collars around their neck, and we're telling them what part of the landscape they like to use or we're able to use. So that's another pretty cool thing that comes from these GPS collars. With that, I think I can go let my voice catch back up, and I'm sure we'll be talking. Yeah.
Thanks, Andrew. technology you all use is really cool. That is a very unscientific way, but it's just, I'm fascinated by it. So thanks for explaining that to all of us. So I'm now going to talk briefly about the proposed regulations. Essentially, the zoning code that's making up this new mule deer combining zone. So this slide, I'm going to just go over the basics really quick, then I'm going to kind of back up a little bit, and then I'm going to explain them, and then I'm going to come back to it. So I just want to reiterate the main points here. So properties of less than 20 acres in residential zones with an existing dwelling, fencing, stuff that's already there, they're basically unaffected. Essentially, if you cannot partition or divide your property, you're not building anything new, we're not making you tear anything down, we're not making you change your fences. Anything that's existing is fine. And I think this is really important because some people have asked me, are you going to make me tear my fence down? The answer is no. We're not. Conditional uses and site plan reviews, so things that trigger land use review of some type, this will trigger fencing standards, and I will go over this in greater detail in a minute. New buildings will trigger siting standards, in other words, where you can put that on the lot. Land divisions and partitions will trigger dimensional standards, so that has to do with size and configuration of those divisions. New commercial uses that are listed in the code, and I'll get to this long list of these specific commercial uses. Those will trigger certain sets of standards. So they're grouped into about 3 different groups. Some of them are subject to seasonal standards, siting standards, locational and size standards. Another note, farming activities are not listed in these conflicting uses. This is another thing that I was asked a lot of questions about throughout. With the seasonal regulations, we're not addressing farm use. Farm use is not part of this. We're looking at certain conflicting uses certain commercial uses that ODF&W and others have determined they adversely affect the mule deer habitat. Farming is not one of that. We recognize that farming is a huge part of Deschutes County's economy and culture, and we're not telling people they can't till their land or do whatever they need to do to maintain their farm. And lastly, all of these standards have alternatives. And I'll go into kind of the why of that later, but we have this list of proposed regulations, but there's also always a more creative solution. If you want to consult with ODF&W, you can call Andrew or his colleagues and find some sort of alternative solution that would result in a similar habitat kind of maintenance. Oh, and I didn't click the slides forward. I'm so sorry. PowerPoint's hard. So first I'm going to talk about the conflicting uses. Now this is all guided by that OAR that I was referring to previously, which kind of spells out how we proceed with shaping this whole thing. A conflicting use is a land use or another activity that's usually subject to land use regulations, so in other words, something that's in the zoning code that could adversely affect mule deer winter range. ODF&W has identified a number of conflicting uses over time. The first WA combining zone has about 9, I believe, that have been identified. Things like golf courses and dude ranches and things like that. And those are carried over. There was a 2009 interagency report that ODF&W and other agencies worked on to kind of further their knowledge and their data, and explaining that, hey, we've realized there's a few other uses that are really conflicting with this maintenance of the deer habitat. And then there's been a few that have been added through subsequent correspondence with those agencies. And these conflicting uses basically form the basis, the structure of the amendments. So this is kind of a little jargony, but this is also pertaining to the way we're going about structuring these. There's something called an EC, or ESEE, and this is also cited in the Oregon Administrative Rules. It basically stands for Economic, Social, Environmental, and Energy Consequences. So what we do is we take each of these conflicting uses that have been determined, we run them through this decision-making matrix. It's this big matrix, set of matrices, where you look at each use and you look at the positive and negative consequences of either allowing, prohibiting, or limiting the use. And those consequences are looked at for economic reasons, for social reasons, for environmental reasons, and energy reasons. So you can see how it's quite a matrix. There's multiple kind of dimensions to that. And it's not meant to be necessarily the most rigorous scientific analysis. It is just meant as a structure, a framework for the decision-making process to say, hey, let's make sure you consider these. And ultimately, they are a little bit subjective. It's not meant to be anything but. If the proposed regulations do change, that EC analysis will change as well. So we put some values out there based on what we think the starting point is for the regulations. That can change. That probably will change. But that's all found in the findings document. It's many tables, but that forms the kind of basis of either allowing, limiting, or prohibiting these particular uses. So for the proposed uses that we're putting on the table right now, we've chosen to just limit all of these uses. So nothing is completely allowed, nothing's completely prohibited. Again, this is a starting point. The existing wildlife area combining zone, there's a number of those conflicting uses are just prohibited, can't do them. So this is different from that in that sense. The Oregon administrative rule requires the implementing measures, in other words, the code that we're writing, to be clear and objective. So a lot of the standards are clear and objective. In other words, it's a number. It's 300 feet. It's a quarter of a mile. It's no one can argue with that number or interpret it in some strange way, hopefully. You can also provide an alternative option that is discretionary. So something like I was mentioning before, consulting with ODF and W to say that there's, equivalent habitat protection. So it was our goal in these regulations to provide clear and objective standards, and then kind of a plan B, another option. As one of my colleagues likes to say, an on the menu and an off the menu. We're trying to provide as many options to people as possible. We don't want to say no. Yeah. Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. So this draft proposal, and I've probably said this a million times already, but this draft is a starting point. I've kind of laid out for you the way this EC works and the conflicting uses. So that's basically setting the structure for how it's all organized. We're putting these dials out there essentially. The public input that we receive through this, the Planning Commission and ultimately the Board of County Commissioners are going to determine how to turn those dials. We're just building the dials, saying that these are the variables. So we look to the public in this whole process to determine, is this not enough of a conservation measure? Is this way too strict? Whatever it is, that's what we're here for. And ultimately, and I'll probably explain this again, so there's a hearing or a set of hearings before the Planning Commission. That begins next week. Depending on how long that takes, eventually the Planning Commission will make a recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. We love it, we hate it, we recommend these particular changes, whatever it is. Then the Board of County Commissioners will have its own set of hearings. We'll relay the Planning Commission recommendations to the board. Ultimately, it's the board's decision. So they can choose to go in whatever direction they choose. Usually they take into account public testimony and the Planning Commission, recommendations, but ultimately the buck does stop with there. That was a deer joke. I didn't mean to do that, I swear. They just write themselves, So with that, I'm going to go through the commercial uses first. This is very small type, and I apologize, and I do have copies of this presentation online. So this is the first set of commercial uses. These are the conflicting uses that I spoke about. This set of limitations involves seasonal limitations on the outdoor activities that are associated with whatever use. So if it's a dude ranch, it's just the outdoor activities associated with that, not the actual indoor activities. There's siting standards for the buildings that are associated with the use. There's locational and acreage standards, all structures and the use areas. So some of that is minimum acreage, some is maximum, and some is distance from a road. And there's fencing standards. And again, this is all for new stuff. A lot of the fencing, and I'll go into that in a little more detail, it's designed to allow for wildlife passage. I'm going to quickly read this list in an abbreviated way, so you don't have to try to read it. We have a golf course, kennel, public or private school, bed and breakfast inn, dude ranch, playground or recreation facility owned by a government agency or nonprofit, timeshare unit, vet clinic, fishing lodge, guest ranch, and outdoor sporting and recreation uses. Some of these are actually already in the existing wildlife area combining zone, some of them are new. I will also note that, and we explain this more deeply in the findings, but for many of these uses, there aren't really that many of them in the county. We're not generally aware of a huge demand for most of them historically. Of course, that could change, but a lot of these decisions were also based on kind of the prevalence of these types of uses. That is very small type. So these are the next two groups of commercial uses. The next is RV parks and campgrounds. Those would be subject to fencing standards. And the third group of commercial uses is solar power facilities and wind power facilities. So those would be subject to locational standards, in which all buildings would have to be located within 1,300 feet of a county arterial. It's meant to kind of cluster development where there's already corridors of development and roads. Again, the goal in much of this is to minimize habitat fragmentation. And government entities, including but not limited to quasi-municipal corporations, are exempt from those standards. We're aware that there's irrigation districts and other entities that will really rely on these types of businesses to stay solvent, to provide service or revenue to their customers. And as I noted before, for all of this, there's always an option. These standards could be waived by the county. If you consult with ODF&W, you can develop some other type of alternative. A different development pattern, a different sort of restriction if you can prove that this will afford equal or greater protection to the habitat. So we're trying to have that option for creativity if you want to go down that road. Residential uses. So new buildings will be subject to siting standards. This would include decks and porches. Generally, the footprint of a building would need to be sited, near existing roads or recorded easements. Currently, that proposal in the draft is it has to be entirely within 300 feet of that road or easement, public or private road. That could change. If all of you feel like 300 is not the right number, I greatly welcome your testimony stating what number you might prefer. But that's our starting point. There's, again, alternative siting if you consult with ODF&W. If you have a weird lot, some sort of strange situation, and you can kind of do some alternative thing, we welcome that. There's exemption for buildings that are accessory to farm use. If you need to put a horse barn in a certain place, you can put your horse barn in that certain place. Residential land divisions are proposed to be limited by partition and subdivision configuration requirements, so essentially a form of clustering. Similar, but not exactly the same as what's in our existing wildlife area combining zone. And this is meant to, again, cluster development, relatively speaking, into one certain area and allow for some open space. Again, there is that alternative to consult with ODF&W. Fencing. So fence standards are designed to allow wildlife passage. This would only apply to properties. Well, it would apply to those properties in those commercial categories where I listed that would be subject to fencing requirements, or anything that requires conditional use permit or site plan review. So something that needs some level of land use review. Generally, you're building a house, you just need a building permit, no big deal. So the general fencing standards, it's a height thing mostly, so it can't be more than 48 inches maximum height, and there's 15 inches of space below. To let deer go over or under. Preferred materials, smooth wire wood, and this is right from our existing wildlife area combining zone. There's exemptions for farm practices. Obviously, you need fences with your farms. And then for really small stuff, less than 400 feet per lot or parcel, if you just want to fence your garden and make sure people or deer or creatures don't eat it, that is acceptable. Again, there is the alternative to consult with ODF&W for this. So, going back to that other slide, and I will remember to click through it this time, to summarize, properties of less than 20 acres in residential zones with an existing dwelling and fencing will be unaffected. Conditional uses and site plan reviews will trigger fencing standards. New buildings will trigger siting standards. Land divisions and partitions would trigger dimensional standards. New commercial uses listed in code, those tiny little tables, those would trigger the applicable standards, whether it's seasonal, siting, locational, or some combination of those. Farming is not included in those listed uses. And again, all of these standards have alternatives, off the menu option. So that's a really brief summary of the regulations themselves. We're going to go into the Q&A now. I'm sure you're eagerly waiting. I know we've been talking for a long time. Just a little housekeeping. So we have, and Peter will be our MC, but we have people here, and I think we'll ask you to raise your hand, and he'll bring the mic to you. We'll also go over to the Zoom. You guys kind of flail if you see a lot of people on the Zoom. We also note that there's some forms out, I think they're still on the table. If you have a very complicated question or something that's a little more in-depth than this public venue, or you're just shy and don't want to speak in front of a room full of people, you can write down your question and hand that to staff and we'll respond to you. You can also email me. My contact information is all over our website. So we do have alternatives if you don't want to talk in front of a room full of people. So.
Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you for your patience. I recognize that this overview took well over an hour. So can I get a show of hands who have questions for our staff? Great. I'm gonna rotate like I did on Monday to spatially kind of target people, so I'm not inadvertently focusing on one area of the room. Before we start, I want to recognize the second planning commissioner is in attendance, Nathan Hovkamp, who's in the back. So we have two commissioners here. On Monday, we had a third planning commission. We may have some planning commissioners that are listening online. They're very interested in this topic. Yeah.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Will Groves, your planning manager. Also, for you folks out there on Zoom, I just wanted to let you know that you'll have a raise hand option there on your screen. So we're going to call you in rotation to ask questions as well. So please use that raise hand function if you're hoping to get a question answered this evening. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to get started. Let's front row in here. Any questions? We'll go right. Okay, I'll come back. There'll be ample time. Yeah.
Yeah, a question about the list of conflicting uses. Potentially, my RR10 property could be impacted if I wanted to build something where maybe code wouldn't allow. And yet, to me, the largest conflicting use, which I would think would be a destination resort, appears to be exempt from this. Why?
Yeah, I got this one. That's a really good question. Can you hear me through this? Is it working? Okay. I can never tell. Destination resorts are actually covered by a separate section of code, and the number is actually evading me at the moment. But so they have their own standards when they develop their master plans, and they have to have, I believe it's a no net loss standard for wildlife. So they go through an entirely different process than this, and they are required, whether they're in a wildlife area combining zone or not, I believe, right? They have to adhere to this no net loss policy. So usually they work with some sort of biologist or experts to devise this policy and determine what they're going to do. So it's the effect is hopefully the same. I will leave that up to interpretation, but it is addressed. It's just not addressed as a specific conflicting use in this section of code because it is already addressed in the destination resorts chunk of code. Does that answer your question? Sort of. Okay.
And then in terms of the rural residential 10 zone, if you're not proposing any of the conflicting uses, then you're not subject to the wildlife area amendments. So if you have an existing dwelling, you're not, and you have an existing fence, you're not subject to the new wildlife area standards. If you wanted to do an accessory structure, there might be some siding standards there, but if your dwelling is within 300 feet, your accessory structure is likely going to be within 300 feet. So think about the approximately 19 to 20 conflicting uses. If you're not proposing an intense use like a golf course or a lodge or a land division, you're largely not going to be subject. You're not going to be subject to these amendments. If you have an existing farm, you're not subject to these amendments. Did you have a follow-up just on?
I saw that there were some restrictions on fencing. It could be over 48 inches, and it couldn't be within 10 inches of the ground. And so if I can't put the fence down the ground, I can't keep the dogs who are running around the neighborhood from running on my property. I just have a question about that.
Yeah, the fencing standards you would only be subject to them if you were applying for a conditional, something on your property that required a conditional use or a site plan review. If your house is just hanging out and you have a fence and it won't be affected. It's only if you're proposing a use that requires that land use review that you would be subject to those fencing standards. I don't know if you all have something to add to that.
Let's go to.
Just to add to that one, there's also no exemption on that for up to, sorry about that, it's very sensitive. There's also an exemption in the draft code for up to a 1/4 acre on your property. So to the extent that you wanted to have some areas fenced off, mostly it's people who want to keep their dogs in. I hadn't heard the perspective of keeping dogs out. So that'd be something that you'd want to comment during the public comment period for the Planning Commission hearing and say, hey, I've got some concerns, dog exclusion's important to me. You know, a 1/4 acre is or is not enough area to cover what I'm hoping to do with fences, and that could be put into consideration for the process. Let's go over to somebody on Zoom now. We've got 2 people on Zoom. We're going to rotate in and out of our online participants. We're going to bring somebody on over, and we've got John Gill coming on over.
And for those who are on the Zoom, if you haven't done this before, when we switch you over to a panelist, you'll kind of disappear for a few seconds. That might be happening right now, but don't worry, you'll come back. Is he coming? He's coming over.
Test, 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 test.
So can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, if you could speak a little more assertively, that would be helpful. But I think we have you elevated to panel. So please, your questions are welcome. We're not hearing you. Are you muted?
No, I think I'm off mute, but can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name's John Gill. Just had a couple of questions. You know, I looked up an ODF&W study that was done between 2017 and 2021, and I don't quite understand this. I actually own property up in the Maupin unit. In the Maupin unit, from 2017 to 2021, the populations went from 2,850 to 1,505. There hasn't been a lot of development up in the Maupin unit in terms of houses, property development, and so we've lost 50% of our deer population up there, and that's true in places like the Wanaha, which has gone from 2,250 to 1,037. That's way up in Northeast Oregon. I don't know how many homes are up there, but probably not a whole lot. So I guess I don't understand some of the need for this additional restrictions on where somebody can put potentially one house that they're restricted to under current conditions in those larger blocks of property. Do the deer really care if the house is on the northeast corner or in the southeast corner? Just a little unclear on that.
All right. Yeah, thanks, John. A few things there. I guess, I certainly wasn't, ODFW, in this process is not blaming development on as the sole factor in the decline of mule deer. That I kind of had that slide of all the different stressors. It is part of it, and up in the Maupin and the Wanaha, those are certainly different areas than here in Deschutes County. There's no question, and you're right about that. I'm not as up to speed on the factors there affecting those populations, but I will say, I talked about how we ODFW try to stick up for wildlife where we can, and a lot of times that's on the public land, whether it's BLM or Forest Service, and working with the biologists and the decision makers there when they have projects proposed, and also it's with our partners at the county. As far as your kind of citing on the lot question, like the back corner compared to the front corner, the intent of the 300 feet from a road rule, that code is pretty standard in a lot of counties in Eastern Oregon as a way they address their Goal 5 concerns. And the intent is to try to keep the development kind of clustered along a main arterial road that exists. Say if you have a strip of properties and the houses are kind of within 300 feet of that road, theoretically the back of those lots on average is going to be more intact or less disturbance. That's the intent of that. So they're not just kind of scattered, wherever across those lots, if you're looking at it from kind of a zoomed out perspective instead of just on a one lot perspective.
Thank you. That's really all I had.
Thanks.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is about the sighting about 300 feet. So I often see the deer along the roads, and they want to get into the property and jump fences and stuff. And it seems to me that the more buildings that are along the road, the more it deters them from that and keeps them from getting out of the way of cars. So I had a question about that and how it was determined that that's a better way to do it than have the buildings further in, maybe all the way into the property. And then the second question is, in the matrix that is online about the conflicting uses and that are ranked from minus numbers to positive numbers, the biggest one was single-family dwellings, which got a -7, and some of the others that are on the list were in the positive. So again, I have concerns about large developments of whatever sort, cluster housing, whatever. Why do they kind of have free reign when, according to the matrix that's in your findings, that is the biggest conflicting use?
I can speak to that second part of the question, and I might also turn to my planning manager, Will. But I think, that it's a very fair question. Part of what the easy analysis does is it weighs all of the factors. So while residential uses might be, they might present a great threat to habitat fragmentation, or they might, be severe in that sense, it's also valued by our county commission and just sort of in general that we can't prohibit residential uses. Or it would probably not go down very well to do that. So we're trying to get this balance. And this is completely the type of discussion that is warranted, I think. The other uses, a lot of those conflicting uses, as I noted, they don't occur very often. So they're just not that, either they're not very spread out, there's not many of them, just in pure numbers, or there's not, or they're focused in one particular area. So the impact is different than housing. And I think housing has been identified as a real need in, you know, we're trying to balance that. We're trying to land this in the middle somewhere. And it's an imperfect answer, I realize that, but there's a choice has been made. It's been a choice to permit aspects of residential development, and there are guidelines for new residential development, but recognizing that residential development is a really important part of the county as well. It's a decision, basically. And I'll let Will follow on to that.
Yeah, and with regard to the table and the scoring, the concern there was that there's, based on a rough calculation, there's a possibility of approximately 1,500 new homes that could be either created on vacant lots or created on lots that could be currently, under the current regulations, be created through land divisions. So the impact, it isn't that each home is a -7, it's that, you know, if you were to do all 1,500 of them and they were to be done without any fencing standards, without any siding standards, that the swarm of them effectively are a very significant impact, with the notion that, for example, a veterinary clinic, we're never going to run into 1,500 veterinary clinics, for example. So the tables are trying to capture the relative magnitude of how often they happen, as well as the impact associated with them.
Yeah, and I can kind of speak to the first part of your question about the deer along roadways and you know, kind of drawn to homes. You know, there's a few things there, and I think it's an interesting question. I think, you know, part of it is if the idea is to keep houses clustered, so the back, you know, parts of the lot are more open and undisturbed on average, but also, you know, those wildlife friendly fences along roads, you know, if there's more of those and more permeability away from that road, that helps that bad situation we've all seen when deer are caught, you know, between two bad fences along a roadway. So, you know, the deer that are attracted to the yard, whether somebody's feeding intentionally or unintentionally, or just for the landscaping that's around a yard, I still think, you know, overall, for the biology of a mule deer herd, it's better to try to have that open space than to try to, they're still going to cross roads. But then to try to draw them away from roads like that. But yeah, I think it's an interesting question.
What about buildings that are preventing them
Yeah.
from getting into that back part of the property?
Yeah, and you know, part of the idea with the buildings and the fencing, if there's a wildlife zone like there is now currently, you know, you can, in that zone, there's more permeability. You know, there are some fences that you know, aren't so wildlife friendly, but there are others that are, and there's just more permeability for deer to move around, and that's the intent of those codes. For yeah, it's kind of the same concept is the comparison I'm comparing to. Yeah, just more clustered and permeable landscapes.
So I'm a farmer and rancher in Lower Bridge. If you look at the population numbers for the Metolius unit, the critical, what I would consider critical mule deer winter range is in around the irrigated farm ground in Lower Bridge. So I'm going to concentrate on that a little bit. If we look at the ODFW numbers from 2010, the estimated population of the Metolius unit was 4,700. It was, you know, 5,600 in 2011. We saw a spike that was shown up there on those graphs, clear up to 9,000. We're currently at a little over 4,000, and we were in the upper 3,000s. So the mule deer population, you know, has a fairly steady base number around our management objective, below it and above it, and now below it again. So in that same period of time, we had a tremendous increase in the quality of habitat due to an increase in the amount of acres of irrigated agriculture in Lower Bridge. So our habitat has increased, the quality of forage has increased, and the numbers have relatively done what populations do. They've gone up and down. So habitat-wise, when you look at those big circles, that's really lower bridge, and that's irrigated farm ground. So where that falls into the planning side is it's also the most restrictive development area in the county based on irrigated land. We've had a very low occurrence of increased dwellings. I'll be honest, I'm responsible for 2 small parcels split off my farm. They haven't changed the wildlife habitat or relationship with the hundreds of deer that I feed every year. I love the deer. I hunt deer. Everybody that knows me knows that. So I think this is an awesome presentation. If Andrew could maybe touch on the quality of habitat and how that plays in a little bit. That's one side. The other side of Lower Bridge is this. Development-wise, the new list, we're right on the edge of the current mule deer winter range boundary. We have dude ranches. We have guest lodges. We have bed and breakfasts. All of those things already exist. A big part of agriculture and our ability to make money has to do with, honestly, tourist type agriculture, more people involved. So we do have more people around our farms. And I am an owner in one of the properties that's a dude ranch. Are we going to be able to work with other properties? I know that we're registered. If it gets mapped, is that going to go away? If we have any other conditional use, or they want to lease, say, my home place and do activities, is that going to be prohibited? I mean, we don't make money dividing land and building houses. And the majority of the 60-some thousand acres of EFU that are listed all have building restrictions based on the amount of irrigated land and acreage already set by the county. So those are kind of my statements or questions for both of you.
Yeah, and you know this because we've spoke many times before, but for everyone else in the room, some of the fluctuation in numbers is through the years. Obviously we're just like the GPS collar changes. We have changed and improved, frankly, the ways we count, our methodology for counting mule deer and our methodologies for estimating numbers. So sometimes, we liken it to sometimes you just have to pull the Band-Aid all the way off quick, right? When you change to a new way of counting deer, sometimes the estimate jumps one way or another, and then you get back to following your trend, because the trend is always more steady than those. So that some of those numbers you were pointing out are the result of that, and otherwise, I mean, I'm here to say thank you to landowners out there who have intact ground or providing refuge and feed for wildlife, for deer and elk, and everything else that comes with that. And we work with folks to address damage and with folks to improve their operation and offset the wildlife presence if it's causing a burden on them. So I think a lot of your comment was a kudos to the Lower Bridge area, and frankly the reason it's such valuable mule deer winter range still is the intactness of a lot of the large properties out there because of the agriculture that's happening out there and because of the value of that to the community. So that's what I'd respond with. I know it wasn't directly a question, but that's just some comments. And as far as the agritourism and that part of it, we've certainly included some seasonal restrictions. I don't know exactly where some of that would fall out on the table, but the prime value and stressful time of year out there is those winter months. So there's some thought there of being reasonable of what we're restricting when you look at the calendar of the months.
With regard, I think you're asking some great questions there. right now, what you see in terms of the draft regulations are just a proposal to start a discussion. So as we go into a hearings process, it'd be important for you to take a look at those regulations and see if there's something that could work for what you're hoping to do in the future. Any business that's out there already operating, it's vested, it's not going to be changed in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed. So these regulations, as they're currently crafted, would only affect new businesses. And in each case, as Tanya referenced, we talk about sort of, there's an option to order on the menu, which says, yes, you can do this, here's some limitations. And then there's what we call the off-menu option, which is, well, if your property is unusual, specific, you got a bright idea, and you can talk to ODF&W, and if you can do something that's, that protects the deer in an equal way, that also could be allowed. So I think it would be important, particularly if you've got a particular business in mind, to take a look at the regulations, give Tanya a call, and it may be that you've got an existing barn that's 400 feet off the road, and you might say, hey, can we set this number to 400? Would that provide an equivalent protection? It would save this business idea that I've got. Because when you think of what the EC process does, it's a way for a community to have a conversation about different values. As Tanya pointed out, we think about economy, we think about energy, we think about social impacts, environmental impacts, and all these things are balanced. So one of the things the Board of County Commissioners could say is they could say, look, deer are real neat, but economics are what's important to us. We're going to do nothing for the deer. That's one potential outcome that could come out of this. Another could be that deer are tremendously important to us, and we're going to ask a lot of private landowners in terms of what they can do. And so this is a wide open process that can go from one end of regulation to no regulation. And the notion generally is that we're trying to, at minimum, pick things that are good bang for the buck. That, we're trying to intrude on people's private property rights as little as possible and still provide some value to the deer. But that's a balancing act, and it's something, Tanya and I, we're not biologists. We don't own property. We're never going to operate a dude ranch. And so that's why it's so important that you're here and that you're participating, because we're trying to figure out what that balance looks like and bring that information before our planning commission, and ultimately the board will decide. So I think it'd be really valuable to have a conversation directly with Tanya and you to give some feedback about how it might affect your potential businesses and how we might craft this in a way that's clever to get the most value up for both deer and what you're hoping to do.
Great. We're going to, I see a couple hands. We're going to get to you. We're going to go back to our virtual attendees and elevate.
And we got Joanne Hartman coming.
Okay, she's getting elevated to a panelist, so welcome.
Hey, Joanne, we can see you there, but you're muted. So you'll need to click the unmute button in your Zoom to speak.
Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry about that. I'm just a bystander, and I'm just here to get educated about what the paperwork actually, just some more clarification on that paperwork that we got from you about the zoning and whatnot. I live in Eagle Crest. We have a home that's already built, and we do not have acreage. So I know that some of this will not affect us. Being in Eagle Crest, am concerned about the Thornburg development that's being proposed and how this will affect them, but they are a resort or will be a resort. So I guess I'm curious how what you're working on with the mule deer zoning will affect them and their development.
Hey, Joanne, this is Will Groves, the planning manager again. So as Tanya had mentioned, I know this question will come up a lot. Thornburg and destination resorts are subject to a separate process than other land use in the county. And they're held to a very high standard, which is called no net loss. So in proposing the resort at the outset, they have to coordinate with a biologist and with the Department of Fish and Wildlife and come out with a program that says that this resort will result in no loss of the species. That's a much higher standard than other people are subject to. So for homeowners, when you put a new home in and fragment habitat, put in fences, you put dogs out there, that's all still going to be allowed. So under these regulations, at best what's happening is some brakes are being put on the degradation of the habitat. For Thornburg and for other destination resorts, they actually have to hire a biologist, and they work on an extensive, 100-page wildlife management plan that talks about how they manage those resources, and that goes through a long public process. So the reason why they're not included in this is because they're already subject to a much higher standard, and specifically which is called no net loss.
Okay, I get that. Thank you. When she said that about the no net loss and that they had a different code, that's what I assumed, but it's nice to have it reconfirmed. So thank you for that. I'll stay tuned for what's happening with Thornburg.
Okay, we're going to go to the next question in the back.
Hi. Could I ask 3 quick questions? I think they're short answers, but maybe one at a time. I didn't follow that explanation of the 20 acres. And maybe it needs to be clarified. Is that because you can't really subdivide a property less than 20 acres?
Exactly. You got it.
Okay. And could the inventory include mapping of historic mule deer range and historic population trends to have that documentation? I think the inventory should acknowledge that there's been a big loss of habitat because of all the urban development that has occurred over the last 120 years. I don't know if that could be, that could have a place in there.
I'm not entirely sure. I mean, the inventory as it stands is kind of this this proposed zone. So it wouldn't necessarily contain historical data. We can provide kind of background data in the supporting documents to that. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I think it should be somewhere in there so people also should acknowledge that there's been a big loss of habitat with development. I mean, these cities have obviously grown on mule deer winter habitat, and I'd like to see that in there. And if ODFW has trend data on populations or historic mapping of range, that would be useful to have too. And my third question, I guess, for ODFW, if mule deer are not at a replacement rate, will ODFW be forced to reduce the number of hunting tags?
Yeah, thanks. And we certainly do continue to analyze that every year and do crank them down. But kind of like I was saying about the buck ratios, primarily we're hunting bucks. Maybe I should have mentioned that. We're not hunting mule deer does almost anywhere in Eastern Oregon at all anymore. So that 70% survival rate of your adult females, hunting's not the cause of that. There may be some poaching and that sort of thing affecting that, but that's not what tag numbers are about. We analyze that every year, but it's not a direct impact.
Okay, next question.
Hello, my name is Mary Jo Hedrick, and I'm a retired ODF&W wildlife biologist, and I'm here today representing Deschutes County residents as the Oregon Hunter Association Southeast Director. As opposed to the existing wildlife area combining zone, when I read it, there are no prohibited uses identified in this new 2023 mule deer winter range combining zone. The proposed combining zone would allow uses permitted outright or by conditional use permits by the underlying zone, including solar and wind energy development. A primary impact of solar development is the near total loss of wildlife habitat and landscape permeability due to the fencing and grading requirements, among other things that these energy facilities require. Energy development and supporting infrastructure, substations and transmission lines in migration corridors and winter ranges have been shown to interfere with big game movements and result in habitat loss and fragmentation that impacts the ability of big game populations to access critical resources. Due to the direct and indirect adverse impacts of energy development and related infrastructure on the big game use of migration corridors and winter ranges, OHA would prefer Deschutes County prohibit solar and wind energy development in Mule Deer Winter Range in the Mule Deer Winter Range combining zone. If the final combining zone will allow energy development, the proposed, and I'm going to list some numbers here, 1891-40 G1 is the use limitations for the energy development states that all buildings will be located within a quarter mile of a county road. Are solar panels and wind turbines considered buildings? And then in 1891-060, under B, for the siting standards, it states all buildings will be within 300 feet from a public or private road. Do the 891-060 standards apply to energy developments? If there are no siting standards or use limitations for solar panels and wind turbines, such as a minimum lot or parcel size or a size envelope as in 040 E2, 3A through C, could the solar panels and wind turbines cover the entire lot or the parcel? Thank you. So there's 3 questions there. And to reiterate, now I've lost them. Are the solar panels and wind turbines considered buildings? Do the 060 standards apply? And if so, if not, am I understanding that a solar or a wind farm in the wildlife area would be able to cover the entire lot? Thank you.
And I think I'll cover that one as well. So remember that the regulations, again, that we have up there are draft regulations to begin a conversation. So the solar panels and wind turbines are not buildings. So there's a difference between a structure and a building. A building's something that you would enclose something in. So, barns, other things like that. So it's expressly set up to allow solar panels and wind turbines in the current example. So it's written very much on purpose that way. And the reason is because this is the EC analysis, again, economic, energy, social, environmental, energy is an important component. So as it's set up currently, the Board of County Commissioners ultimately will be asked to balance between the values of the habitat value lost from the potential solar farms that occur versus the energy potential that comes out of those. And right now, as it's set in the draft decision, the value of the energy is put up relatively higher, recognizing that definitely will hurt habitat. So, as you participate in this process, particularly as we go forward to the Planning Commission hearings and the board, it would be important for you to voice that you had concerns, I think this is where you're going, that, that the existing both code and analysis weight the value of energy too high and habitat too low, and that balance should be shifted in some way that's different. But right now, it's set with the energy value. Basically, in each case, when a regulation, a limitation is being explored, that limitation is to be commensurate to balance those values. And right now, energy is set relatively high as something that it's important to generate. It's it's important economic activity. We've heard from a number of the irrigation districts that that's something that's important to them. So at least at the initial code and discussion analysis, it's set high. But we certainly welcome feedback, and this would be a great time, as part of that planning commission process and going on to the board to let them know that you think that those values should be set differently.
But does 060 apply to them? It's a little confusing to me when I was talking to Tar.
Yep, you got it, Tarek.
He was telling me that 060, I thought he said 060 applied to everything. But when I read it, I can't quite tell that. So I didn't know if they have the quarter mile from a county road and the 300 from the access road. And that would be just for buildings. So basically, the way this is proposed and written currently, solar panels could cover the entire lot or division or parcel or whatever.
That's my understanding of the way that it's set up.
Okay, we're gonna shift over to this corner. We're gonna do back-to-back questions. We have a married couple here, so I'm caught in between. So I'm letting both of them go first. So I can't just pull the mic away.
thank you so much for this presentation tonight. It's great to be able to see the information, ask questions again. As I'm reading in the proposal, there was one paragraph of information that kind of jumped out at me, and I just wanted a little more explanation how it fits, I guess. That the county, and I'm just pulling it from the middle of a paragraph, so you can go ahead and give me context. But the county may include conditions of approval limiting duration, frequency, seasonality, and total number of all outdoor assemblies occurring in the zone, whether or not such outdoor assemblies are public, private, secular, or religious. And I just feel that that language is so big and couldn't necessarily be, or it could be capricious in nature if trying to like decide whose assemblies are falling under the conditional use permit. So I was just curious if you could give us a little more explanation to that language.
Oh, that's going to be me again. So that language was in response to a specific case that we dealt with. We had someone up in the Lower Bridge area who was looking to have weddings on his property. And one of the things that comes out, there's a federal statute called RLUPA that deals with religious institutions. And there's a number of provisions, but one of them it's very clear about is it says you can't treat religious organizations differently than a secular organization. So if I had, for example, a downtown district, and I said, hey, you can have an Elks Club, where a bunch of people get together and hang out in a building, but you can't have a church, that law says that that's completely prohibited. And so when you look at the language there, we put that in specifically to deal with that, to make it clear that it doesn't matter who you are or why you're getting together, it's how you're getting together. So, if there's a place where, if you want to get 30 people together in a building, it doesn't matter if it's for religious purposes or if you're the Cub Scouts, the county's got to treat it the same.
Just for clarity though, if I want to have a wedding on my property, do I have to go get a conditional use permit, even if it's like one of my daughters?
No, so this is kind of a longer discussion. I'll give a very short version of it, is that when you think of what counties do, they regulate land use. So if you were going to establish a restaurant on your property, you'd need to have parking and all sorts of things. There's some things which are accessory to a residential use. So if you have a house, you're going to have a garage. If you have a house, you're probably going to have, your kids might, be in Cub Scouts or Girl Scouts, and they might have, a get-together on, Sundays to do crafts in the backyard. These things happen at houses. And it's one of the things that's allowed is if you want to get a family member, if a family member wants to get married once and, a couple times in a lifetime on your property, you're marrying off a kid, something like that, you go through what's called an event permit. It's a one-time thing, really just making sure you got enough bathrooms for people and there's a safe way to get on and off the highway. So for those one-off events, they're not regulated. If in turn you were going to say, hey, I'm looking to have weddings every Sunday all summer, then that's something that's subject to that type of permitting.
I'm Barron. I'm Alicia's husband. So we live off Klein Falls Highway, and my question is about human life safety with a 300 feet. And that is, if you build a house right on the highway, we've got kids. Kids are going to tend to play around the home. Just this year alone, 2 vehicles have rolled off the highway, not on our property, but on my direct neighbors. One I share a fence line with. The other one is right across the highway from us. We happen to live on a turn. It's the first turn after the straightaway if you're going towards Eagle Crest. And, they've taken out trees. They've taken out fences. If my kids were out there, they'd be dead. And I have a big concern about 300 feet against a highway. That was your yard? Okay.
Yeah, that's a great concern. It's one of the things that, would be an important input into a process. So it'd be important for you to remember, as Tanya explained, tonight, this isn't part of the public hearing process. It's an informational process. You're asking a great question. What you'd want to do is you'd want to either comment in writing or at the Planning Commission hearings or the board hearings about that concern specific to your property and about hazards associated with it. It'd be interesting to see, on your property what you think might be a reasonable number. Is there something special about your property that's different than others? Is there something about the fencing standards that, to identify an area for your kids that you might want to play in? Is there some sort of exclusion? When I was a kid, if I had 10 acres, I would be on 10 acres. If I had 20 acres, I would be on 20 acres. So, just some thoughts about, I can see the concern. I certainly wouldn't want my kids playing within 100 feet of, any road with a curve on it. So a real concern. And then a question, if you've got any bright ideas about how to measure, you've heard why it's important to put houses near the road for deer. And this is a balancing act. So you're also, here's something that's not great about having houses near the road. So real interested in your input and having you participate in the process.
Okay.
And if you don't mind me jumping in real quick, I certainly empathize and understand that too. I'll just point out a lot of times in these applications when folks come to ODFW, it's not this intent's not to keep houses close to highways necessarily. There's always feeder roads and existing easements and driveways that also count as a road under this. So usually there's a way to get back in there. Yeah, I don't know your property, but just I'm throwing that out there.
Yeah, and just to add on one other thing is that in the existing wildlife area combining zone and the proposed new one, there's a regulation that there's a kind of a safety valve that says, look, you can do something else if you go and you talk to ODF&W. So, if there's some other reason, if, there's something else specific about the property where it makes sense to put it some other place, sometimes there'll be really good habitat very close to the road, and somebody will say, hey, I don't want to cut down all of this stuff. I'd rather put it in this area that used to be a gravel pit in the back. So that there can be property-specific circumstances that will also cause ODF&W to say, yeah, you should put it someplace else for the deer. We'd like to see that.
Okay, next question.
I have a question and kind of just an overview. I mean, I watched this whole deal here. Can you hear me okay? And yeah, and we're hearing that the cougars are on the rise, the wolves are on the rise, the human population's on the rise. Auto strikes are on the rise. I read an article from you out of the Bulletin, a couple of years ago, and it was a 10% death rate on the collared deer, and now it's 18. Is that correct?
It was the rate was declining 10% annually for a few years there. It's tough.
Anyway,
yeah,
we acknowledge openly that we had 30,000 people here back in the 80s, and then we had 50,000 in the 90s, and now we have 100,000, and then we're going to have 150,000, and we have this increasing predation. We're going to have this increasing automobile strikes and all this other stuff, right? And then, so my basic question is, and I just don't think this is actually going to solve the problem. I mean, I applaud the effort. I'm for the deer. I'm for saving the habitat. But here's my worry. My worry is can you tell, I mean, I don't think you could tell us, but I mean, it's not true that if we apply all these overlay zones that the mule deer population is going to quit declining and it's going to increase. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it's not. You're not going to reverse that trend with one pull of the lever.
Yes.
And that was trying to point that out with the death by 1,000 cuts that. But I will and I got asked this same question the other night at Sisters too. I mean, what I will say is it's not going to hurt.
No, I agree with that, but here's I think this is every landowner's concern.
Mm-hmm.
Is it looks like we're the responsible party to turn this around because there's mountain biking, there's sports shooting, there's hiking with dogs, there's these model airplanes, there's all of this other activity. And if I live out Highway 20, if you go out Highway 20 on the weekend, you can't find a place to park. I mean, it's full. I mean, so the impacts of the predation, the impacts of the additional humans. I mean, even though we have a large urban area and we got an urban growth boundary, that doesn't stop anybody from going out and being actually in this deer habitat. And I'm not even saying we should curtail any of this stuff. I think we might want to really think about, do we really want 27,000 deer? Because maybe that's not going to work out when we have 200,000 people here. We're just going to have more car strikes. I don't know what the answer is. I'm not even suggesting anything. I'm just saying that I'm worried as a landowner that, that if this doesn't turn it around, then all of a sudden we're going to have harsher and harsher land use restrictions, and that's still not going to turn it around. I'm just worried that we don't have actually a plan here that's going to turn it around. And that's just my thought, okay?
So we're going to go back to Zoom.
Hi.
Hi, Doreen. We can hear you.
All right. You know, I missed his name, the gentleman that was on Zoom that said something about historic data posted with it. And I think that is just a fantastic, if you guys have data as clean as the ones we just saw, you know, strange things pop up with historic data. Like maybe they're getting killed when they cross an east-west road, or, you know, just some weird ways subdivisions are maybe built. Anyways, just, I love that idea. I just wanted to revisit that. And if there's any way to post a historic data and kind of track that without a whole bunch of extra work. My other thing, and you may have already went over it, but I missed it. You said something about they do come down for shelter, juniper trees, for example, and with the juniper tree removal initiatives that they're doing, does that run a chance of having a negative impact on the deer? I have heard they eat the berries and other stuff in really lean times.
Yeah, thanks, Doreen. I can certainly speak to both of those. You know, the historic data thing. You know, we have numbers from the past. I will say it gets coarser and coarser the further back you go because of those technology and advancements in analysis and statistics and the way methodologies. The stuff I showed tonight is the good stuff, and you go back further than that, and it gets rougher and rougher. Just as far as you know, trend data. So, you know, nothing's going to pop out beyond what this newest stuff we have from the last couple decades. That said, your question about junipers is a good one. There is a lot of, generally, juniper removal is a good thing for mule deer because, you know, with fire suppression, juniper is vastly expanded into its range, and you know, a lot of that area that is now juniper woodlands of 60 years old or so, you know, historically was shrublands. And if you have a landscape that's in good condition, you know, there may be a few junipers there, but there's also large bitterbrush and sagebrush and those sorts of things on the winter range, and those can also provide that thermal shelter. So I guess, in short, your question about the juniper removal projects, generally those are good for wildlife, and I don't worry about running out of juniper in Central Oregon.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah.
Hi. I have a lot of questions, but I'm kind of just going to narrow on one of them, and that is the different zoning. Can I sit? Oh my God. The different zoning. So the mule deer overlay, and then the wildlife overlay is next to each other. There's both deer zones. However, the one that's over my house has proposed regulations to restrict my land use, versus I go to take my kids to school from Tumalo to Summit, and I see several deer, but there's not going to be any regulations on that. And I'm not for regulations. I think that land use is something that's very important, but and especially when it comes to property owners. So basically, why is it that there's these regulations over one area and not the other? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Just a quick note. Yeah, so there is the existing wildlife area combining zone, which is deer and others. So like Andrew was saying, there's other species there, and that's existing, and we're not touching that one. And then this proposed one is the 2023 mule deer, and that's a separate area. And as you acknowledged, in many cases, it's right next to the existing. Sometimes it's not. You know, you can see on that map, it's usually adjacent. It's sort of an extension. And I'll probably turn to Andrew on this, but the area that was drawn by ODF and W was drawn for kind of all the reasons he explained, of preserving habitat in the areas that were identified in all of their data. So I'll let him speak to that, but that's the impetus. You know, the ODFW data of what the deer need and where they need it is why they drew that line where it is. It doesn't mean there aren't deer in other places, but I think, you know, they're less. That habitat is either less.
My next question, one of several questions.
Okay.
So the tracking that was used, was there deer tracked in like downtown Bend? Was there deer tracked in Shevlin? Was there deer tracked in Skyline? You know, or was it just these specific winter range areas, these 9 that you talked about?
Sure. No, that's a great question, and the vast majority of our capture to get those collars out, you have to get your hands on it on a deer to put a collar on it. The vast majority of it is via helicopter and a net gun capture crew. So naturally, we're not swooping down in Tumalo and blasting deer with a net gun out of a helicopter, and so that does lead to some gaps in that data, and that's just. But that said, we also deploy collars on deer, on their summer range, and they move, and they go back down to winter, and they end up, in Tumalo or somewhere else. So you get dispersal that way. As far as were collars on town deer? No, we don't put collars on deer in Bend. In town, there are some deer that still leave when they should. Migratory behavior, but there are a lot of deer that do not exhibit that migratory behavior anymore. And those deer in Bend generally are not going up on the national forest and providing an opportunity for people to hunt them or see them, or they're not being those wild deer anymore. So generally, we're not collaring those groups of deer. Occasionally, a collared one will end up right on the edge of town just by those migrations. But that's kind of the way that breaks down.
So going back to the original question, how did you determine the regulations and that this specific overlay being different than the original overlay, if you can't capture everything, the whole, in a whole?
Yeah, and so I don't think any of my maps showed it, but there's something called biological winter range that ODFW as an agency has for Eastern Oregon that kind of shows, without political boundaries, without political considerations, the biological range of where deer spend the winter in Eastern Oregon. So naturally, county by county, when the Goal 5 protections get put into place, it's not the entire biological winter range that gets included. There's political considerations and meetings like this to decide where those lines end up being. So the original WA zone in Deschutes County that's been around since 1992, it was just a portion of that range. This effort was to, especially since we have the more advanced data to really get fine scale, was to try to add to that, not replace it or overlap with it at all. The protections in that original one are going to remain. The original polygons are going to remain. This effort is a proposal to add to that. And as far as where we drew the lines, you're right. Some of them do butt right up against the existing one to try to make that a more continuous thing going forward. Otherwise, we had to. Some of them we cut to that biological winter range line. Like the more wavy one out on the desert in the southeast corner there. That's the edge of that biological winter range. That's another tool we used. And otherwise, we kind of just had to draw a line on the map somewhere where our data supported it. That's where the group kind of went with that process.
Let's give you a pause. Is there someone else who has a question? We'll go to you. If I can.
I was wondering where you got your fence specifications, because standard wildlife fence is 18 inches off the ground and 42 inches high. And I don't know where you got the 15 and the 48, and I would suggest you maybe look into that, but I will be commenting in the public area.
Thank you. Those were carried over, as far as I understand, from the existing wildlife area combining zone? Yeah, and noted. Yeah, no, that's super helpful. This is why we're here, but, okay. Thank you.
I can give you 50 papers that show.
No, okay. No, I'm not arguing. No, that's super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody? We'll go back to.
Back to the ODFW. So when you were tracking, you have 212 trackers. And then the rest of the data was collected by a helicopter with one flyover. Is that correct?
Yeah, good question. And we had, there's, like you said, study-wide, there were almost 500 callers, but locally, yeah, a couple hundred that are given that data. And the other data, the dots, the concentric different sizes of dots, those are from a combination of helicopter flights. I think the example I used up there was the last 5 years, so 2018 through 2023. So yes, helicopter surveys, which are a good way in those areas that are less roaded and tough to get to and snowy and all that. And also in December when we're doing our counts, we're usually on the ground, so driving around in pickups, and those data were shown on there as well.
Thank you. Come back to you. We have someone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question.
Thanks for coming this evening. I appreciate the presentation. I think it would be helpful for folks who are either viewing the video or live streaming or following up. I think it'd be helpful for them to know where they could find the existing wildlife overlay standard criteria, where in our code, like what the chapter of the code is and how they can find the code under the Muni code.
Yes, thank you. No, that's a very good point. So our code, and I will find the URL, but essentially the code chapter number for the existing wildlife area is 18.88. And the new one is 18.91. There were some things in between. We couldn't make them sequential. We have a site where we have our entire county code, and I don't know it off the top of my head.
It's under Muni code.
Yeah.
And then select
Oof. The way I have a strange URL, but it's under Municode and then select Deschutes. Thank you, and I can certainly help people get to that, but I have it bookmarked, but as DeschutesCounty.municipalcodeonline.com. And that's actually all of our code, not just zoning, so if you want to know about animals and business licenses, you can find that too. But it is chapter 18.88 is the existing WA. 18.91 will obviously not be in there yet because it's just a proposal, but that's why we have those drafts on the website. Thanks for that suggestion. That's helpful.
I have a quick question there for Fish and Game there. So on the 44% of the tags that were not recovered, you didn't know what happened to them, on those deer. And then I can't remember the numbers right off the top of my head, but the illegal kills were something like 13% or something like that, or 18% or
22.
Whatever it was. My question is I hate to even think about this, but I would think that maybe the illegal kills are even higher than that, because it just seems logical if you poached a deer that you would do everything in your power to hide the call or disable it or something like that. And so it seems to me like a lot of the 44% that's unknown is actually not really unknown, because it's probably more cougar takes and animals that get, I understand how GPS works pretty well, and you have to have a clear view of the sky for it to work. And so if a cougar buries or hides a deer carcass, then that collar isn't any longer findable because it doesn't give you a signal. And the same thing would apply to the illegal kills. I hate to think about it, but I think the illegal kills are probably higher than you think, because it just makes sense if how do you know the number of illegal kills? That was my first thought I had in my head. How do you know that number?
Yeah, no, good questions, and I'm happy to talk about this, go into depth on this stuff. So, the 47% is the number. 47% of the callers of mortalities that we went in on were unknown causes. Now, it's a little misleading because a lot of those, we find the deer, we find the caller. It's July and it's 110 degrees and it's already toast. Or the coyotes have been, a lot of times a deer will die, and even if it's a cougar kill or a road strike, if coyotes or other scavengers are moving that carcass around and fighting over it, that keeps that collar active, and it doesn't trip and send up that mortality notice until they're done scavenging and there's nothing left, and then it lays still enough to trip that mortality signal. So that's a lot of the unknowns, is something where you get there and it's a a pile of bones with not much left and a collar. So you can't say whether it was a disease and just died or scavenged or what. So that's, but I hear you, and it's the answer to how do you know your illegal kills number. A lot of those are collars that are cut with a knife and thrown in the brush, basically. And you know that it was on a doe deer and it's January and there's no legal way that anyone should be possessing that deer. Yep. 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 No, good questions.
Next question.
So I don't want to hijack this whole deal with the Thornberry or whatever that place is called out there, the other side of Klein Butte. But Andrew, just your take on irrigated areas in terms of winter range, like, and forage. Do irrigated areas during winter months create better forage in terms of sustaining food sources for your elk and deer in the wintertime?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different avenues there that we could be talking about, but they're generally in Central Oregon from December to March 31st. There's not a whole lot of vegetation left on the ground, especially if somebody's cutting that hay or whatever. If it's a field that's left with some stubble, yes, they do value that. Sometimes you get some fall green up of those open areas with good soil and grass present. So there's no question that those open space, large parcel irrigated fields are valuable for wildlife. Yeah, yep. And I hope we've highlighted that and the value that the agency and the county and everybody places on those large, agricultural parcels. Yep.
Okay, we have one more. All right, then we'll wrap it up.
The question is it a true statement that the mule deer that winter in Deschutes County filter into 6 other counties surrounding it?
Yeah, and that's a good question and some of the benefit of that collar data I was talking about earlier. But yes, I think especially on the one with the centroids and the lines going every which way, it shows just how much dispersal there is across county lines. So that's kind of was my lead off, right? Is that we work at a different scale than a county level, so it's a little difficult during county processes. But yeah, it's certainly a more connected than our geopolitical borders.
Okay, unless there are any other questions, we'll conclude this evening's informational open house. We thank you for.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I have 2 more slides.
You have
just
2
with
more
hearing
slides.
info and
Okay.
closing.
Yeah. You can actually. Why don't you bring it to a close?
Okay. Sorry to.
No, that's great.
Gotta use my slides. You all probably know this already, but we do have the slides up. So, the public hearing, April 13th, so 1 week from today, this room, we expect a lot of people. We haven't determined how late we're going to go, but we definitely anticipate if there's people who want to come back or if there's a huge crowd, we will recommend to the Planning Commission to continue it. I think that's highly likely. You can also participate by Zoom. We just posted the packet and the Zoom information today, so you can find that on deschutes.org/meetings. I'll probably post it also on the project page. It's not quite on the project page yet, but it is on the meetings page. Yeah, so if we do have additional public hearings, the next 2 regularly scheduled Planning Commission meetings are April 27th and May 11th. My guess would be that that's when they would take place. Don't quote me on that. It's not my decision, but that's what we think. The goal is to get the Planning Commission process wrapped up by the end of June. There's going to be a change of 2 planning commissioners, so we want them to be able to close out that process and not kind of have it straddle 2 sets of commissioners, because that would be confusing for everybody. And like I said, after the Planning Commission process is wrapped up, it'll go through the Board of County Commissioners. And TBD on those dates, but we will check in with the board and get direction from them on that timing. And lastly, again, I'm going to plug the website, deschutes.org/muledeer. You'll find everything. This presentation is posted up there, the entire record. So if you want to see the public comments that have been coming in, we have the maps that you can play around with, the proposed amendments, all of that stuff, my contact information, the information about the Redmond info session if you want to go on Monday to Redmond. And then lastly, that's my email address. If you want to submit written testimony, just send it there. Make it clear if you can that that's testimony. You can also just write to tell me stuff or ask questions, and it can be not part of the record. It's up to you. So that's all of the kind of housekeeping stuff. If you want me to relay questions to Andrew, I can do that as well. Yeah, that's kind of it. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it. I hope this was helpful, and yeah, that's my last word. Yes, Mary Jo.
It's a procedural question.
Yeah.
So you're taking all this input and you say, do this. So 3 informationals, then we have public testimony.
Uh-huh.
Are you then going to take all these comments and review them and maybe make changes before they go to the plan? Or would it be the planning commission who would make the changes?
The latter, yeah. So basically, right now I'm collecting written testimony, people who are emailing me. That'll be kind of bundled together with the verbal input that the planning commission hears at the various hearings. So then I will make a memo saying, hey, this is how many people commented. This is the general, trying to summarize it the best way possible. The planning commissioners also will have full access to the record, so they're making the decisions on this first round. So they'll say, we'll tee it up for them and say, one issue that really came up a lot was solar panels or whatever that is. And then they will kind of tease out that discussion, but ultimately it is them who makes that decision. And they'll say, hey, Board of County Commissioners, we recommended that the solar panel stuff should change. So that's how it kind of gets relayed up the flagpole. We're just the facilitators of the process. So. All right, I think that's it. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, AV team. Thanks, Will. And thank you all. Really appreciate it.